In two videos, we look at the history of Methodism in the city. In this, the first, we concentrate on the period from its origins in the 19th century until the coming together of the Wesleyan, United and Primitive Methodist churches in 1932 to form the Methodist Church of Great Britain. At first, there were only Wesleyan Methodists, named after their founder John Wesley, who travelled the length and breadth of the country on horseback and by carriage to preach. Often this took place in the open air to large crowds which had gathered to listen to him. During the course of his journeyings, he covered some 250,000 miles, more than the distance between the Earth and the Moon. From the journals he wrote, we know that 3 times he passed through or near Lichfield, but didn't preach there. It is said that he preached where he was needed most, so being in a city so staunchly Anglican, he must have felt that no preaching by him was needed. The first Wesleyans who we know came to Lichfield and stayed were Thomas Coke and some senior preachers. Coke was a trusted confidant of John Wesley. In 1784 he was ordained by him as superintendent of the Methodist Church in the now independent United States. At the inaugural conference in Baltimore that year, Coke, seen here on the left, ordained as a joint superintendent the kneeling Francis Asbury. He spent considerable time in America and was quite taken by the Episcopal system used by the Methodist Church there and wanted this system introduced here, so in 1794 he convened a meeting with senior preachers. It was vital that the meeting be in secret, so Lichfield was chosen since as yet Methodism had not arrived there, so no one would know them. It was held in an unspecified inn somewhere in the city. These were tense and trying times since, on the other side of the Channel, the French Revolution with its reign of terror and upturning of the old social order had been taking place for 4 years, and there were fears that the same could happen here. The meeting did not go unnoticed, as the participants, being obviously educated and intelligent, soon drew attention to themselves. It was reported to the magistrates, who ordered that the meeting be closely observed. It was, in fact, brought to an abrupt end not as a result of action taken by the magistrates, but because a commercial traveller recognised one of the meeting's members and let it be known that those at it were no less than Wesleyan preachers. Coke himself could have been the one recognised. Standing only 5 foot 1 inch high, he was rather small even for that time, and quite rotund. The mere mention of Wesleyans was sufficient to raise the ire of the Anglicans in the city, so the meeting hastily disbanded. So deep was the Anglican anger at the Wesleyans that the Independents were often taken for them, and their members pelted with rotten food thrown by mobs as they made their way to services. It's perhaps unsurprising then that we find the Wesleyans first meeting at the edge of the city. All non-Anglicans were allowed to have their own place of worship as long as they registered it as a dissenting meeting house, either with the local clerk of the peace or bishop. This freedom was given by the Toleration Act of 1689, which we see here being given the royal assent by William III. In the bishop's register, it is recorded that on the 21st of September 1811, a house at Gallows Wharf, commonly called Potter's Wharf, was registered as a dissenting meeting house. Gallows Wharf was situated on the canal, where the London Road crossed it, and was handily placed for the transport of goods to and from it, being between the London and Tamworth roads. The bishop's register states the house was occupied by Joshua Kidger, who was the wharfinger or manager of the wharf. The Kidger family had strong connections with the Wesleyan chapel built in 1778 in the hamlet of Griffitham, some 5 miles to the east of Ashby de la Zouch. Having come to Lichfield and being filled with evangelistic zeal, he had set about forming a group of Wesleyans known as a society. The society grew quickly, and the need arose for a chapel in which they could all meet and worship together. The society was now strong and confident enough to move into the city centre, and a plot was found in Lombard Street and the chapel built. In front of the church, a small graveyard was later established. Joshua was wealthy enough to employ an ostler, or stableman, who it is said found a purse containing money. Despite extensive inquiries, the money remained unclaimed, and it became the first donation towards the cost of building the chapel. The chapel was registered by Joshua Kidger in the Bishop's Court on the 20th of December 1813 and opened by Reverend Dr. Adam Clark, President of the Wesleyan Conference, the following year. At this time there was no organ, and singing would have been to the accompaniment of a band and choir. A reenactment of such a band and choir by Wade Street Church, Lichfield, is seen here. The Lombard Street Chapel had 12 trustees. William Kidger was Joshua's brother and a class leader at the Griffitham Chapel. Henry Burton was from nearby Swannington. Samuel Wotton was a builder and carpenter, local preacher and leading Wesleyan in Tamworth. In 1815, further help was sought from the Griffitham Chapel, and John Kidger, in response, came over in the June for 3 years to assist in the work and build up the cause at Lichfield. Sadly, by the middle of the 19th century, the headiness of the early days had become a memory. In 1851, an ecclesiastical census was carried out, and the Lombard Street return shows only 22 adults present at the morning service and 41 at the evening one, in a chapel that could seat 250. In 1886, Lichfield became part of the Tamworth and Lichfield Wesleyan Methodist Circuit, and in the minutes of the circuit quarterly meeting held on the 25th of September 1888, the following resolution is recorded. Proposed by Mr. North, seconded by Mr. Cox, resolved that the circuit stewards and secretary with the society and chapel stewards of Lichfield form a committee to secure a suitable site for a new chapel at Lichfield. The only reasons found for having a new chapel were that Lombard Street had become both unsuitable and inadequate, but in what ways were never specified. A membership of only 40 but seating for 250 hardly suggests that Lombard Street was bursting at the seams, necessitating the building of a new one, as was the case with the erection of the Tamworth Wesleyan Temple, which we see here, built some 11 years previously. Several locations were considered. One of these was the area in front of Lombard Street, but this was not considered to be large enough. In the end, it was decided that 32 Tamworth Street was the most suitable, but because of the time taken to reach a decision, it meant that £100 more was paid than should have, as only 4 months earlier the property, as described in the newspaper advertisement shown here, had been sold at auction for £250. It was an odd choice of site. It was not rectangular, but bent and tapered to the south. Because of the adjoining properties, there would be difficulty in ensuring the new chapel had adequate natural light. Further, there was the additional cost of clearing the site of the shop, living accommodation and outbuildings. The stone-laying ceremony took place on the 12th of August 1891 in front of a sizable crowd. This was followed by a public tea with tickets at 6pence each in the Guildhall. It's recorded that at this time some £700 was still required to meet the building cost of £2,341, which included the costs of adapting Lombard Street as a Sunday school. Despite the site problems, the architect, Thomas Guest of Birmingham, was able to design a magnificent edifice seating 300 in Victorian ornamental Gothic style, which was in complete contrast to the Temple, the mother church in Tamworth. The builder was Edward Williams of Tamworth. The church was opened by Reverend Dr. Thomas Stevenson, President of the Wesleyan Conference, on the 20th of April 1892. He was evangelistic and socially minded, founding the National Children's Home, of which he was then principal, and was instrumental in forming the Wesleyan Deaconess Order. Shortly after the opening, this photograph was taken showing the minister, Reverend George Fish, front row, fourth from the right, with the trustees and other officials. This captures the bygone Victorian era of a male-dominated society in all respects. In 1898, the Million Guinea Fund was established to raise money for Wesleyan causes. Each chapel had pages on which the names of those giving could be entered, all of which were later bound together in volumes. In 1920, the adjoining property, Tamworth House, was purchased for £760, with the intention of building a Sunday school on the site. The former Lombard Street Chapel had continued to be used by the Sunday school, which started with classes at 10:30 a.m. before the children proceeded to the chapel to join the first part of the morning service before being dismissed. However, in 1921, the Sunday school ceased using Lombard Street and moved to the church. Of course, the Sunday school anniversary was held in the Tamworth Street Church, and here we see the children, with the girls all dressed in white, seated on the anniversary platform in 1917. In this photograph from around the same period, the space occupied by the anniversary platform now has the harvest display, the nature and composition of which has changed radically over recent years. Following its vacation by the Sunday School in 1921, the Lombard Street schoolroom was purchased by Lichfield Women's Institute. In the 1970s, it was acquired by the Jehovah's Witnesses, who, in the late 1980s, demolished it and built their Kingdom Hall. In 1923, it was decided to start building the schoolroom in the garden of Tamworth House at a cost of some £1,300. The schoolroom was opened in 1924 with about 60 children. Here we see the schoolroom in the 1950s and early 1960s. Every church needs its stalwarts. Notable among these during the 1930s and 40s was Frank Halfpenny. He became a member during the ministry of the charismatic Reverend Lawrence Booker, who had drawn many into the church. Here we see the membership card issued to him following his admission into membership in March 1924. He was a man of great principles and carried his Christian faith into all aspects of his life. He became a councillor, magistrate and sheriff of Lichfield. He is seen here first on the left as the sheriff. Frank was ably supported by his wife Mary. He was a fine local preacher who, in the 1950s, could hold a crowd of teenagers spellbound with his oratory. In 1924, the church was extremely fortunate in having Reverend Albert Sturzaker to succeed Reverend Lawrence Booker. He was eloquent and able. He carried on the work started by Reverend Booker. So pleased was everyone with this that he was unanimously invited by the Circuit Quarterly Meeting to stay for an extra year. Not usually associated with Methodist churches were the 3 fine stained glass windows, one of which was Suffer Little Children, given in memory of Mary Waite in 1902. The others were The Good Samaritan, given in memory of Martin Waite, and A Knight Receiving the Crown of Life from the Angel of God, given in memory of Mr. W. J. North. 8 and 11 marked the coming together of 2 groups who had broken away from the Wesleyans to form the primitive Methodist Church. These were the Camp Meeting Methodists and the Clowersites, led by Hugh Bourne and William Clowers respectively. The 2 from the Potteries had themselves been expelled by the Wesleyans because of their support for what were known as camp meetings. These were open-air meetings including public prayer, preaching and love feasts. Mow Cop on the Cheshire-Staffordshire border, shown here on an old print, is regarded as the birthplace of primitive Methodism, for it was here that the first camp meeting took place. It was in part organised by Hugh Bourne and held on the 31st of May 1807. On the 7th of June 1807, Hugh Bourne visited Lichfield to register a wooden hut erected for a second camp meeting at Mow Cop on the 19th of July. While there, he attended a service at the cathedral, which caused him to be deeply concerned at the spiritual condition of all persons, the parsons there. It was to be another 13 years before Lichfield was visited by another primitive Methodist. In 1820, Samson Turner was sent out by the newly formed Burton-on-Trent Primitive Methodist branch of the Tunstall Circuit as a missionary. He arrived at Green Hill on Whit Sunday and preached successfully there among the caravans of the showmen, who, we are told, were gathered there. He arranged to return a week later to preach again. Armed with this knowledge, a church warden arranged for a number of people to be present to disrupt the service by banging tin cans, kettles and tambourines, which resulted in the service being adjourned to elsewhere in the city. Nonetheless, his efforts did not go unrewarded, and on the 28th of November 1820, Samson Turner registered a barn, possibly similar to this, in St. Chad's parish for the Primitive Methodists. Sadly, it seems the cause failed, but the Primitive Methodists firmly believed the adage, "If at first you don't succeed, try again," and several further attempts were made to establish a permanent presence in the city. The turning point was the provision of 2 missionaries by the Birmingham and Darlaston Primitive Methodist circuits in 1836. In 1837 they arranged for the renting, at £5 per year, of a former malt house in Back Lane, perhaps like that shown here. Despite the many inconveniences, at its core it had a number of dedicated and faithful souls who constantly prayed that the Lord would provide them with a chapel. Their prayers were answered in 1845 with the arrival of John Henshaw, who had moved to Lichfield from the Manchester area. He brought with him all the drive and expertise required. A site was found in George Lane, and he organised raising the money and building of the chapel. By the end of 1847, the chapel had been completed at a cost of around £146, of which some £57 had been raised. It was described as commodious and was 30 by 24 feet, seating 150. The opening took place over 2 Sundays, the 2nd and 9th of January 1848. Intermittently, the opposition felt by Samson Turner on his second visit to Greenhill had continued. Prior to the tea meeting on the 10th of January, arranged to conclude the opening celebrations, we learn of an unidentified clergyman going round trying to put people off attending by telling them it was a sin to enter the unconsecrated house. This didn't deter the 100 or so who sat down to partake of the complimentary tea. The Primitive Methodists were not the only group to secede from the Wesleyans. As far back as 1797, a group had, and became the Methodist New Connection. The division arose as the result of the dissatisfaction of Alexander Killam, a Wesleyan minister, with the power given by the Methodist Conference to ministers at the expense of the laity. Because of his outspokenness, he was expelled. Initially, the movement, with an equal number of ministers and laity at its conference, was based around Killam's own chapel in Sheffield, where it thrived, and soon began to spread throughout Britain. In 1826, as a result of disagreement at Lombard Street, some left and joined the New Connection. They met in a house in Sandford Street, let to them by a Bradbury Tunstall, who may have been amongst those who left. In 1833, land in the nearby newly built Queen Street, comprising 278 square metres, forming part of Brown's Meadow, was secured, on which Ebenezer Chapel, seating 230, was built opposite the newly constructed Queen's Head and opened in 1834. Unfortunately, the cause did not prosper. In the 1840s, it seems that there were financial problems, with the trustees taking out 2 mortgages totalling almost £350, a substantial sum then. On the 31st of March 1851, the chapel was only a fifth full at the main evening service. Later in the decade, the inevitable occurred. The chapel closed and was sold in 1859. The Lichfield Wesleyans and the Primitives continued on their separate ways until the momentous event in 1932, when the Wesleyan, the Primitive, and United Methodist churches combined to form the Methodist Church of Great Britain. It was not to be long before the Methodists at Tamworth Street and George Lane physically joined together to become Lichfield Methodist Church, and the story of its growth to be the church we find today will be told in part 2.